Interwar Economy. The First World War, which was fought between 1914 to 1918, was mainly fought in Europe, but its impact was felt around the world. Economic and political instability resulted, and it took more than 3 decades for this situation to stabilize. Wartime transformations. The First World War was fought between two power blocs. On the one side were the Allies, Britain, France and Russia. On the opposite side were the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary and Ottoman Turkey. The fighting involved the world's leading industrial nations, which now harnessed the vast force of modern industry to inflict the greatest possible destruction on their enemies. This was the first modern industrial war. Machine guns, tanks, aircrafts and chemical weapons were used on a large scale. Millions of soldiers had to be recruited and millions of people died. During the war, industries were restructured to produce war-related goods. During the war, industries were restructured to produce war-related goods. The war led to the snapping of economic links between some of the world's largest economic powers, which were now fighting each other to pay for them. Here we can see the workers in ammunition factory during the First World War. Post-war recovery. That means recovery after the war. The war led to the snapping of economic links. Britain, which was the world's leading economy in the pre-war period, faced a prolonged crisis. The war had led to an economic boom, that is, to a large increase in demand, production and employment. Many agricultural economies were also in crisis. The rise of mass production and consumption. After a short period of economic trouble in the years after the war, the US economy resumed its strong growth in the early 1920s. US economy of the 1920s was mass production. The move towards mass production had begun in the late 19th century. A well-known pioneer of mass production was the car manufacturer Henry Ford. Industrial practice of mass production soon spread to other goods such as refrigerators, washing machines, radios, and other consumer goods. The housing and consumer boom of the 1920s created the basis of prosperity in the United States. Large investments in housing and household goods seemed to create a cycle of higher employment and incomes, rising consumption demand, more investment and yet more employments and incomes. Mass production lowered the cost of goods, thus increasing the purchasing capacity of the people. This is the US car manufacturer Henry Ford, the leading car manufacturing company in the US. The Great Depression. The Great Depression began around 1929 and lasted till the mid-1930s. During this period, most parts of the world experienced catastrophic declines in production, employment, incomes and trade. The exact timing and impact of the depression varied across countries. This depression was caused by a combination of several factors. A major cause for the depression was the glut of agriculture products, causing price to fall and loss to farmers. A major cause for the depression was the glut of agricultural products, causing price to fall and loss to farmers. The second major cause, in the mid-1920s, many countries financed their investments through loan from the United States. The withdrawal of the US loans affected much of the rest of the world. In Europe, it led to the failure of some major banks. The United States' attempt to protect its economy in the depression of doubling import duties also dealt another severe blow to world trade. Banks had also slashed domestic lending and called back loans. Faced with falling incomes, many households in the US could not repay what they had borrowed and they were forced to give up their homes, cars, etc. As unemployment soared, people trudged long distances looking for work. Ultimately, the US banking system itself collapsed. Migrant agriculture workers, you can see they are homeless. India and the Great Depression. In the 19th century, colonial India had become an exporter of agricultural goods and importer of manufacturers. The Great Depression affected the Indian farmers more than the urban dweller. India's exports and imports nearly halved between 1928 and 1934. Prices in India also plunged. Peasants and farmers suffered more than urban dwellers. Agricultural prices fell sharply. The colonial government refused to reduce revenue demands. During these days, India became an exporter of precious metals, mainly gold. The famous economist John Maynard Keynes thought that Indian gold exports promoted global economic recovery. Building a world economy. The post-war era. The Second World War broke out a mere 2 decades after the end of the First World War. It was a war waged for 6 long years on many fronts, in many places over land, on sea, in the air. As a result of this, millions of people have been killed in the war. 2 crucial influences shaped post-war reconstruction. The first was the emergence of the United States as the dominant economical, political and military power in the Western world. The second was the dominance of the Soviet Union. It had made huge sacrifices to defeat Nazi Germany and transformed itself from a backward agriculture country to a world power during the very years when the capitalist world was trapped in the Great Depression. Here we can see the devastation in Russia during the Second World War. Post-war settlements and Bretton Woods institutions. The main aim of the post-war international economic system was to preserve economic stability and full employment in the industrial world. Its framework was agreed upon at the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference held in July 1944 at Bretton Woods in New Hampshire, United States of America. The Bretton Woods Conference established the International Monetary Fund to deal with external surpluses and deficits of its member nations. The International Bank for Reconstruction and Development was set up to finance post-war reconstruction. The International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, and the World Bank are referred to as the Bretton Woods institutions or sometimes the Bretton Woods twins. The post-war international economic system is also often described as the Bretton Woods system. The international monetary system is the system linking national currencies and monetary system. The Bretton Woods system was based on fixed exchange rates. In this system, national currencies, for example the Indian rupee, were pegged to the dollar at a fixed exchange rate. The dollar itself was anchored to gold at a fixed price of $35 per ounce of gold. Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods. The early years of the post-war. The Bretton Woods system inaugurated an era of unprecedented growth of trade and incomes for the Western industrial nations and Japan. The growth was also mostly stable without large fluctuations. These decades also saw the worldwide spread of technology and enterprise, decolonization and independence. When the Second World War ended, large parts of the world were still under European colonial rule. Over the next 2 decades, most colonies in Asia and Africa emerged as free, independent nations. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were designed to meet the financial needs of the industrial countries. They were not equipped to cope with the challenge of poverty and lack of development in the former colonies. But as Europe and Japan rapidly built their economies, they grew less dependent on the IMF and the World Bank. Thus, from the late 1950s, the Bretton Woods institutions began to shift their attention more towards developing countries. Many of the less developed regions of the world had been part of the Western empires as colonies. Even after many years of decolonization, the former colonial powers still controlled vital resources such as minerals and land in many of the former colonies. The end of Bretton Woods and the beginning of globalization. Despite its status as a superpower, the United States could not sustain the status of the US dollar as the world's principal currency. The fixed exchange rate system collapsed and the introduction of a system of floating exchange rates was established. The scene changed in the 1970s as high wages. The making of a global world. These are the ruins of Indus Valley civilization. The making of global world started as early as 3000 BC when an active coastal trade linked the Indus Valley civilizations with present-day West Asia. The various silk routes. Silk was one of the first products to cross the shores of its origin. It is believed that noodles traveled west from China to become spaghetti. Traders and travelers introduced new crops to the lands they traveled. Conquest, disease and trade. By the 18th century, plantations worked by slaves captured in Africa were growing cotton and sugar for European markets. In the 18th century, the world changed completely. China and India were among the world's richest countries. During the 19th century, the world changed completely in the 19th century too. The economic contribution towards globalization is considered a major factor, and this has been characterized into 3 types. The first is the flow of trade in goods, example cloth or wheat. The second is the flow of labor. The third is the movement of capital for short-term or long-term investments over long distances. The role of technology. The railways, steamships, the telegraph played an important role in the 19th century world. Colonization stimulated new investments and improvements in transport. Faster railways, lighter wagons and larger ships helped move food from one place to another cheaply and quickly. I hope the topic, the making of a global world, is clear.